On this episode, you'll use all you've learned and gathered to survive a big-ass difficulty spike. Welcome to Save Every Universe. My name is Alec Garcia. I am looked down on by my human coworkers and despised by my fellow androids because it's my job to hunt them down when they deviate from their programmed behaviors.
That's Blade Runner.
Yeah, very good.
That's iRobot.
Close, yeah, very close.
All right, and I'm Robbie. I'm a mechanical king who used a giant sword to shatter Star Road and will stop at nothing to conquer the world with my living weapons.
I was going to guess Mario Kart, but that's Rainbow Road, and there are no swords in that. And then there's also probably a number of other reasons why that's wrong. But
yeah, there are.
Who were you last week?
Last week I was Batman from the Telltale games. I want to make sure I specify so I don't have to never Batman just off the table from then on. There's so many versions.
Yeah, there are. Your thing last week though was pretty broad. It had a little twist at the end that made it specific.
Right. That's because that's where I'm at in the Telltale game.
90% of your thing was generic Batman.
Right. Well, I was still Batman.
Mm-hmm.
I'm Batman.
Yeah, I mean, you could say I'm Robbie and I'm from Krypton.
I could have been Supergirl.
Yeah, I guess.
Maybe Crypto.
I'm just saying it was a little bit
general. And look,
before
before you write in, I don't know Crypto's origin story, okay? So if you're like, oh, he's actually from Earth, okay, I'm sorry.
Would that be true?
I don't know where Crypto's from. You think I start reading a bunch of Crypto comics?
Yeah, I don't know. You have your little app and you're always...
Well, it's a Marvel app generally, and...
barking in my ear about movies and shit and what they did right and whatever.
Listen, if you're a Crypto fan, I feel for you. You can feel free to write us and enlighten me on Crypto's backstory at saveeveryuniverse@gmail.com.
Yeah. And last time I was Rasputin from Destiny 2, because I've been playing a lot of that since the expansion, and
yes.
We'll see how that continues in the near future. We'll see.
We're still playing it. We sometimes bitch about it while we're playing it, because we're very strong-worded. We have very strong feelings, but we're still playing it while we're bitching about it.
I know.
So that's
yeah. And if you listen to our first-person versus third-person perspective, we talked about that quite a bit, of even though it's a fairly broken in some ways, very frustrating, Bungie's kind of douchey, all of that's true, but it's still kind of a hard game to replace if you're a fan of it.
Yeah, it's true.
There's not that many alternatives to it as a first-person MMO RPG type. It hits kind of all those bases, and no other game really does right now.
We'll probably follow up on that actually after E3.
When they announce Destiny 3. Just kidding.
Or they'll probably announce the expansion. They'll announce Anthem's got that big tech demo that should
I
be
would
cool.
love to see Anthem I want to see it do well. I want EA to pull their head out of their ass, because even though it's not quite the first person, it won't scratch the first person itch, I don't think, the way Destiny does. It will at least be another big title in the loot shooter arena to give everyone a run for their money. I think it'll be good. I hope it does well.
I love BioWare, and I'd love to just see a real contender, because that's good for all of us. Any type of competition in a world where
in a fairly new genre, so that would be great.
We'll have to follow up on that later, because that's not what this episode is about.
It is not what this episode's about, nor is what we're about to talk about. We got an email from Pirate Kaizoku, Pirate Chef from our Dad's a Destiny clan.
Yeah.
Hey Pirate, what's up, man? I'm gonna preface this. Our last episode was about Detroit and story-based games. Right. Do they count as games? All those kinds of things. So this is in response to that. And he said, I really enjoyed Heavy Rain and the Walking Dead seasons, but for some reason the Game of Thrones and A Wolf Among Us and Borderland Telltale games never really held my attention. Beyond Two Souls was also okay, but I was disappointed overall. I will wait for Detroit and probably pick it up at a deep sale. The child abuse kind of hit me hard in the trailers. Since becoming a father, I react strongly to stuff like that. I agree completely that I have to be in a different mood to play these types of games, because it's not necessarily a game and it's not necessarily a movie. He said I would really consider them games, though. I think having too much choice can water down a narrative experience, but Quantic Dream, the developer of Detroit, usually does a good job. Detroit seems pretty ambitious, though.
And you played the demo and you really liked it.
I loved it. I've pre-ordered. As of this recording, it comes out tonight, actually, so I'm all preloaded. I'm excited for it. I think I watched all the Dev Diary stuff. I think it looks really good, and some of the reviews that have already hit have said that it, like he said, it's ambitious, and they really, even though it's not perfect, they hit a lot of those high marks, pushing that choice-based narrative genre to a whole new place, and it's getting, from what I can tell, pretty good reviews so far.
Right. I mean, games like this really engage your mind in a way that I think is probably different than any other game type. So if you want to check out the rest of what we said, if you missed last week's episode,
go check it out. Give it a listen. I like what he said. He says, since becoming a father, I react really strongly to stuff like that. I've been thinking about that lately with how big of a wuss I am with horror games now, and that's part of it. I really think it is. Gaming is a little bit different after you become a parent. It's I think that's true. Scenes like child abuse or just horror games in general, it's it's hard to put your mind there. You have different responsibilities, you have different emotional attachments, but I think that's true too with games like even Last of Us or even God of War. I think those strike new notes with me that probably wouldn't have before I had kids. Yeah, and I think with God of War in particular, I think that's cool because I think the average gamer is older, right? 30, a lot of them have kids and that kind of thing. It's cool that
we talked about that.
These characters are growing up with with us, right? And they're
Yeah, it
telling
is cool.
stories that are relevant to us with characters we grew up playing. I don't know. I think it's cool.
It's smart from a business standpoint too, right? Because we have the purchasing power now. Like we're the ones, the kids that grew up now have the money. So you'd be stupid to like ostracize us and cut us out because we're the ones writing the checks now. So
okay, we're not talking about any of that stuff on today's episode. So today we're talking about boss battles today.
Yeah.
What makes a good one? What makes a bad one? What have you on the docket today, Rob?
This was a fun one to research, actually, like especially from a designer's standpoint, because I always obviously think of it as a gamer. So when I was seeing like some of the formulas and how like it was so that formula or some of these formulas and aspects could be applied universally, it was kind of impressive that something like so formulaic could still feel so unique as a gamer.
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of formulaic. There's like, tentpole moments that are really significant, but they all sort of, formulaic is the right word, but as a gamer, it's like when you don't notice that it's formulaic, they did it right in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and I think a lot of games do a good job. There was an article I read that talked about it went through some really key elements too of a boss fight. And this guy was a developer for...
I think he worked on, if it's the one that you're talking about, the one I'm thinking of, is he worked on Portal, and he worked on a couple of major ones, maybe Zelda.
I know he started on Ratchet and Clank, was the first boss fight he'd ever designed. And so it was kind of cool seeing his learning curve where he like overdid it and added stuff that wasn't even possible and had to dial it back. And then like, I know he used Zelda and Portal as like just
examples. Maybe that's what I'm thinking of.
I think they were his favorite fights.
Yeah.
But there's some cool elements that he talked about in that. One of the first ones that makes sense, but I had never thought about, was like training your player to know the mechanics.
Yeah.
And in his article, he used things like different Portal mechanics, putting the personality cores in the incinerator. You would had to put the companion cube in the incinerator. Or in Ocarina of Time, you had to do the hit the energy ball back and forth mechanic.
Oh, yeah.
You do that really early on in the Forest Temple, like well before ever getting to the end of the game.
Yeah.
So that when it comes back around, you, the player, don't feel like, what is happening? I don't understand. Like, you have at least enough confidence to go forward. And as I thought about that, there's a lot of games that kind of do that introduce these mechanics or baseline things early on. One of the examples that comes to mind for me, if you've played, this isn't actually true in Breath of the Wild, but any of the earlier Zelda games, once you get a bow or a mirror shield or whatever the like treasure is for that dungeon, you have to use it in the boss. And so like the whole dungeon is kind of training you on how to use.
That's what actually when I think of boss fights, I immediately think of Link to the Past, where you got the bow and you had to like shoot the thing in the big eyeball.
Yep. And in Link to the Past, also think about like there was the squid thing. I don't know how to describe it, but you had to use the hook shot to pull the parts off of it.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
make it vulnerable. And you couldn't actually damage the boss until you'd hook shot all the
armor
orbs off of it. I think that's a good example of using a game like before you get to the boss, you have to know how to use the mechanics and whatever, because a boss fight is kind of a test. It's like it's testing you up to this point. Have you mastered your skills, your knowledge, your whatever's available to you, right?
Actually, I really like it when you get a piece of gear like kind of right before.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So like you might get the thing in the dungeon and then you might navigate a few rooms and then you have to use it on a boss where it still feels kind of new and you're still figuring out this new power, and then you have to, there's enough time that you learn it, but you kind of get thrown in and have to overcome this huge obstacle. And then once you're out, having that tool opens up all these other exploration possibilities, which is kind of how it worked in Link to the Past.
Right.
You could now hook shot across rivers or whatever it was.
Yeah, I think that tactic is okay, but it can lead to like a frantic, like, oh my god, I don't know what I'm doing or how to use this.
I mean, there's a fine line between like, here's this thing, go figure it out on the boss or whatever, between that and like getting it in the dungeon and sort of having enough time to warm up and learn it before you get thrown in.
You know what's kind of interesting about Breath of the Wild, which defied this, it was interesting talking to other players about how they fought bosses, because you could use lightning bolts, or it depended on, because there was no linear order, when I fought a boss, it might be completely different than when you fought a boss.
Yeah, you had a very different experience. It's like lightning focused. I think it's the big one in the desert, and I got wrecked on that. It was the last one that I did, and for some reason, like I had even powered up my hearts and stuff, and I just like couldn't do it. I went out and I found all like the rubber armor that like boosted your, and I think you didn't have as much of a hard time with it.
No, I didn't.
That was
and
cool.
I don't
it was
remember
sort of
why. I was using different techniques than you were using. I think I was using like the lightning power up to hit him or to like knock him out of the sky.
Yeah.
There was just different ways of doing it.
Yeah.
The boss where you fight in Breath of the Wild, where you fight him up on top of a temple and he does like wind stuff, and he was really hard if you fought him first, but like by the time I got to him, I already had the Master Sword. I had all kinds of cool, I think a lightning arrow like knocked him out of the sky immediately.
Okay.
Or something like I remember it being really easy, like embarrassingly easy, because he was like the third guy I fought and I was like ready to get in there, but I had already done so much that I just tried new gadgets, new stuff, and it worked really well. But it was so different because it didn't follow that hand-holding. Not hand-holding, but it didn't really prepare you. You didn't know what you were
had
going
to
be
kind of go in
against.
and solve the puzzle of the thing, which is that in itself is one of the keys of the boss fight, right? Is there's always like that pattern of like going in and getting wrecked the first time a lot of the time, and then being like, okay, all right, so he fires here, and then, you know, if I get his health to this place, then he goes into phase 2, and a lot of it is memorizing the pattern. And then I think one of the other components that maybe we could talk about too is there's always the mechanics, the pattern, the what powers do they have, what equipment do I need? It's like the very mechanical nuts and bolts side of it.
Yeah.
And then the other side of it is the boss fight as a character, where because a boss fight, no matter how big and scary, isn't always satisfying if it doesn't make sense in like the larger world of what you're doing.
Yeah, boss fights should be like a really important story component. There has to be more to it than just a big random thing, right? You have to be building up intensity. Like a good boss fight has been ramping up intensity. You kind of know you're up against it. There's plenty of games where you see like the monster's tail, or I think in that article they wrote about the Half-Life, the 3-head bird pecking boss, how like leading up
the
to
Hydra
that,
sort of thing.
but you had seen it like knock through walls and kill scientists and do all this stuff leading up to the fight. I think that's really cool when
building the threat. You see how violent and destructive this thing is, and you're like, oh my gosh! Like
then
at first you're like, holy crap,
I can't beat this thing.
And then you're like, oh crap, I'm gonna have to fight this thing. Yeah.
Right. Resident Evil, I thought, always did that as well.
Yeah. So when I thought of favorite boss fights, Resident Evil, some of them were from Link to the Past. Like I loved a lot of those boss fights and the way you're talking about using the gear and all that stuff. But especially in Resident Evil 1 and 2, I feel like they really tapped into something that was true to the game, because you were always kind of under-equipped, and the genre's survival horror, right? And so a lot of times you were just like running around and kind of popping off some shots, and you were surviving. Like that was the essence of the boss fight. And then over time, there would be like an opportunity that opened up for you to actually take that boss out, right? Like with the crocodile thing down in the sewers in Resident Evil 2, it was like you just had to run away and you could kind of shoot, and then you had to figure out how to like get the gas tanks to fall down. Or the tyrant fight at the end of RE1, where you just had to run around and survive until they finally throw down the rocket launcher to you and stuff. They made them big and epic and scary, and there was good ramp up to them, but they also did it in a way that was really true to the genre.
That's true. I mean, you definitely felt vulnerable, right? And it wouldn't have made sense to like, you can't gear up for those any more than
scraping
just like
survive to that moment, so there's no treasure chest you pop before you go in or whatever.
Or like I've been saving. I mean, sometimes you try and save up as much as you can, but
you never had enough.
And you couldn't do like what you did in like a Final Fantasy game. You couldn't go grind. You couldn't be like, well, I'm going to over level, which has its own satisfaction in different boss fights.
Yeah, going in and feeling like you really put in the work to just whoop its ass.
That's always kind of, I always liked that feeling, especially in games where like they have a boss fight that's harder than the final boss.
Yeah.
I think Final Fantasy X was famous for that, because there were like those were ridiculous. Kingdom Hearts, the Sephiroth fight is harder than the final boss.
Oh, really?
I mean, that's significantly.
Final Fantasy VII is a great example of like the slow burn lead up. The whole game you're leading up to fighting him, and that boss fight is insanely difficult.
It was cool too, because when I go into a boss fight, I want to feel like it's like all of me versus kind of all of it, especially like the end of the game boss fight, right? And 7 was cool because I feel like in RPGs you kind of pick your team, and then that's what you spend your time on, and that's it. And you have like 6 other assholes who you've been dragging around the whole game.
Yes.
But in 7, if you remember, there's like 3 forms of Jenova, right? But one of them, the final hard one, it's your team in branches, and you actually rotate through them and like take turns and pass it off. So you kind of wanted to have enough materia for everybody, and like the payoff of getting everybody's gear and everybody's limit breaks and all that stuff like really paid off in the end, which I really liked, because I think in an RPG that's kind of unheard of. I mean, even though the final Sephiroth fight that you like can't lose is really cool, it's not hard. That's more like just a cool like victory finale. The final like Jenova fight where you're like rotating, is it? I guess it's not Jenova. I know you fight Sephiroth when he's like attached, and
I think that is the big final one.
Yeah, when you're rotating around the different parties.
Yeah, I think
thought that was so cool.
Yeah.
I still haven't really seen that done as well since.
Where you had the whole team came together.
The whole team. I mean, makes sense because the whole game has been designed not around that, but I thought that was a cool workaround of like rotating your party out. Suikoden or Suikoden or however you say it, Suikoden 2 had a cool version of that, but it was a midpoint boss. He wasn't even the final boss of the game.
Interesting. Yeah, that is always a letdown when the sub bosses are more memorable or more. And I actually feel that way. I saw in your notes you said, "What's your favorite Ganon fight?" And I don't have one. In fact, when I think about Zelda, I can't remember any of the Ganon fights. The only one I can remember is the Breath of the Wild fight, only because I played it recently. When I think of Zelda boss fights, they're always like the end of a dungeon or something like that. That was this cool, memorable thing where you got this cool piece of gear. Or I feel that way about Zelda. Ganon is like sort of like the inevitable thing that you have to do. The dungeons along the way more.
I really liked Wind Waker because it's like, it has this like sense of inevitability. You're on top of the castle and it's flooding. It's kind of like we're all going to die anyway. And then you got to square off with him. And he's not a big monster. I mean, you fight him as the beast and then you like catch him on the roof and he's in his like samurai robes with 2 swords.
Okay.
And it's like this really badass duel and like the whole world is flooding down on top of you and you and Zelda have to like take him out.
Oh, together.
Yeah,
I beat that game. See, I don't remember any of that shit.
It's so cool. It's like so cinematic. And the fight follows a lot of those tempos. Like you start out with like checking his patterns and then he increasingly like ups the intensity. Yeah. He'll start like blocking behind him. So like even if she's shooting at him and you try stuff, it gets to where she's like, she has to reflect arrows off of your shield and then it stuns him and then you attack him. I mean, it was a really cool ramp up and it didn't have to rely on like a big scary monster because most boss fights, and there's plenty of good ones, are like this huge scale, right? They're massive. But the final duel with Ganon was this one-on, like mono-y-mono, I mean, and Zelda, but like they're kids. So it's like 2 kids versus an adult and we're all going to die anyway, but like you're still like, I'm going to die taking out the King of Darkness or whatever. And it ends with Link burying the Master Sword up to the hilt in his head. And I was this is so cool. Like, especially for like a kind of lighthearted
cartoony style,
But it was like a pretty grim, and I mean, he lives. It's a happy ending for Link and Zelda. Spoilers for Wind Waker. Come on, GameCube. But it was so cool, and you just bury the sword in his head. Like the best way to end with the Master Sword.
I don't remember that. I mostly remember just like sailing around, and I loved the map, and I loved the world, and I loved the style. It's
a great game. It's still one of my favorite Zeldas.
Yeah.
That fight to me, even though I do like the big duels, there's some really cool duels with Ganon, but that one to me I think captured like the desperation maybe of like the whole struggle.
Well, I like what you were saying earlier about how like when you hit that final end boss, you should feel like you have nothing left, that you left it all on the table. You gave everything to vanquish this final evil.
Right.
I think a lot of games don't do that well. It's just kind of like one more boss to finish the game and put the cherry on top. It's not this final struggle where you leave it all out there.
Yeah, my favorite boss fights have that finality to it, that you might die doing this, that suicide mission almost.
Right.
I mean, obviously Mass Effect 2 it's called Suicide Mission at the end, but like the Mass Effect games, even Chrono Trigger is a good example of that, where you're like carving your way into the heart of Lavis.
Right.
All time is like freaking out and you're not sure how this all ends.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
But it ends happy, of course. But actually, I wrote in my notes, I don't know if you saw that, Lavis is a cool example of going from bigger to smaller. He's a 3 phases. You start when he's huge, you fight your way into the next phase, he's big, and then the final form is the smallest, and it's the, like, epic.
See, I think that's kind of cool, right? Because, like, throughout the story, this villain presumably is getting more and more powerful and deadly, and you're getting more powerful, and then you have to finally face him. You sort of peel the layers back off of that onion and get to, like, the core of who this villain is and have one final showdown. I think that's actually a cool way to do it. And I think, like, BioShock, a lot of people complained about that final boss because
I saw that.
It was like inexplicably, I loved that game and it was a great game, and I didn't hate the boss fight, but it was sort of like why are we doing this now? Like, it didn't quite make sense in the context where you have sort of this tense showdown with the guy, and then he, like, all of a sudden he turns into like this monster who's all jacked up on Eve or whatever it was, and it kind of didn't make any sense, and it was sort of like the opposite of what you're saying, and it didn't make sense in the context of the game at all.
Yeah, those can be weird and jarring. Like the developers feel like, well, we have to put a
boss fight has to be big
or whatever. If you think about some of the brilliance of like Halo 1, no boss fight. It's you against Halo. You're blowing it up and then you got to drive off of it. There's no like big bullet sponge son of a bitch. Like, it's you against literally the ring that you're trying to destroy, and so it's like you versus the environment, and that's the final boss. And I really liked that.
And they did a good job though, in kind of at the point where it would get boring to just keep killing Covenant over and over and over. They introduced the Flood. That was almost like their workaround in terms of keeping pace of the game.
Yeah,
to introduce another character type and do a twist in the story instead of having like, now here's a boss fight.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, especially if you play games that Bungie has developed now, where there are those bullet sponge guys and there are these like huge, ridiculous...
I'm leaving that in.
Huge, ridiculous guys that take like 20 minutes of shooting. Like, Bungie didn't used to do that, or at least not. I mean, Legendary, a hunter took a lot of bullets.
And a lot of the developer blog posts that were talking about, like, here's how to develop a good boss fight, talked about how you're basically cheating. If you do that as a developer, you're cheating. If you just turn him into a bullet sponge, or you just ramp up the difficulty and think, okay, now it's a good boss fight, you're not really even getting, as a designer, what the boss fight is for. It serves no narrative purpose. It's not really grand or super epic. It's kind of just nothing. It's like now here's something harder before you do a bunch of other shit.
It is kind of like that, and it's kind of a letdown. I mean, Bungie's done some cool stuff in their raids. They've done both. They've done the bullet spongy thing, and they've done some cool mechanic-based puzzles that you have to solve with.
Where you really have to
people.
come together as a team, and
those are cool, and I like those challenges. But the bullet sponge thing, I'm not a fan.
It is kind of cheating.
And the Division kind of had a problem with that too, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wildlands is cool because it's not. You may die really easy.
Yeah.
But
Did you play the expansion, Fallen Ghosts?
No, huh?
The end of Fallen Ghosts, you have to kill this target, but he just has like a shitload of troops around him and stuff. And I thought that was a good way to make
okay with
you
that.
still have to like sneak in and take him out and do what you're doing for the rest of the game. It's true to the game, and it is more difficult, but it's not just like now you just have to shoot the shit out of this one guy.
Yeah. No, I think I'm okay with that. I'm okay with hordes of enemies because I can still feel skilled and just overwhelmed, but the bullet sponge thing...
Again, another good example of games that did boss fights right. I think of Metal Gear Solid 1. Right. Like Sniper Wolf and Psycho Mantis, every single boss felt completely unique, like you were fighting this real villain that had a backstory.
Right.
By the time the boss fight was done, you kind of talked to them and got their side of things. And you
almost felt bad killing them sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, because they were like fellow soldiers doing what they thought was right. And the fights, though, were like a really unique problem to solve every single time. And true to the story, mechanics were great. It wasn't hard just for hard's sake. It was, man, those were just like some perfect boss fights, I think.
You typically had to master the stuff you'd gotten.
All the way to the end where you're just bare knuckling down with Liquid Snake on top of Metal Gear. It was like that was the perfect end. That was the perfect boss fight for how far you'd come, and you had that leave it all on the table kind of feeling.
All right, so do you have a final like favorite boss fight of all time?
You know what? I don't actually. I even when I was thinking like what are my favorite boss fights, I get so sucked into like the world and the characters and the exploration and stuff. I'm not typically that crazy on like, oh, that was the best boss fight ever. I would maybe put the Resident Evil 1 Tyrant fight, because I remember just feeling like so satisfied at the end of the game that you had gotten all the way to the end and survived that. I think of God of War, the early games God of War, all like pretty much all those boss fights. I loved those. And no one had ever really done that on scale. Side note, on the new God of War, I did feel like I think they're going to do it in the next one, but I did feel like that was, you haven't finished it, have you?
I haven't finished yet.
Okay, so, but no spoilers, but I felt like those big, like really big, taking down a giant god type thing is kind of missing from that game. You get so much other good stuff that, because the game is so damn good, but I did miss that. I missed like a big epic boss fight. Like some of it felt a little bit, press this to block. It's like that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And I did feel like some of that stuff was missing, but yeah, so early Resident Evil stuff. Yeah. What about you?
Besides the ones I've already mentioned, the Kingdom Hearts 1 and 2, the Sephiroth fights were cool, and I think it's because it just came with a sense of pride when I beat them, because you could level and you could get the best swords, but you still had to be so on it of like dodging, jumping, duck, move. Like you could, even if you like over leveled, quote unquote, you weren't going to roll him. He could still one shot you or two shot you.
Yeah, see, that's cool when it still comes down to planning your moves and those kinds of, even no matter how powerful you are, you still have to have a little bit of skill and thought. I like that.
Yeah, so any of those fights where I feel like it wasn't just, even though I like the over leveling fights, the fights where I had to be fast enough, quick enough, and be on it, even though some of that is pattern memorization, if I've been tricked enough into thinking like it's not just always the same thing, I got to be like really reactive and on my toes.
Right.
It feels more like a boxing match or something where I'm like watching the opponent, reading his moves, react. Like those are the most satisfying to win. Those are the ones I like jump up afterwards. I'm like, that's it, I got him. You know, those are the best feelings.
Thank you for listening to Save Every Universe. If you enjoyed this episode, please go give us a review on iTunes, or if you have feedback, send us an email, saveeveryuniverse@gmail.com.